the judges ready? Excellent. Timer? Very good. Judges, the estate tax represents the flawed policy and the flawed politics of Washington. It represents a tax that's not only inefficient for the government and the economy, but it's completely flawed because it's actually a greater tax on the poor than it is on the rich. Yes, the estate tax, contrary to popular belief and what would seem logical, the estate tax is actually a further burden on the poor than it actually is on the rich. And I'll be demonstrating this throughout my speech today in responding to the negative team's arguments. I'd like to start off by first addressing their three burdens that they said in order to warrant an affirmative ballot in today's round, we would have to fulfill these burdens. The first burden was that of investment is hindered, and the second burden was that of investment creates jobs. My response to this is that in the last speech, the negative team agreed that we fulfill these two burdens. They said that investment is hindered by the estate tax. They said it's not as much as we would assume, but they did agree that investment is hurt. The second thing was that investment creates jobs. They also agreed with this in their response to savings. They said that investment creates jobs. They actually specifically said that in cited evidence. Thus, right now, in today's debate round, we fulfill the first two burdens. Now, the third burden was that the criterion is upheld, and that in the end of the day, and when we look at disadvantages and advantages, the affirmative has to win. Well, that's kind of the point of debate, so we completely agree on this, and we'll be deciding this throughout the debate round. I hope that I can convince you judges that the estate tax does need to be repealed. Let's move down to their individual arguments. Now, the first argument was with regards to justification one, that of the increased revenue without the estate tax. Their first argument was against the solvency evidence that said that government revenues would be increased. They had a solvency indictment first, and they said that it basically says false evidence. I have four responses. My first response is this is from the Center on Budget Policies and Priorities. Why should we uphold their opinion in comparison to two other organizations? Why should we uphold their position on this issue when they haven't published a study themselves? The Center on Budget Policies and Priorities has not published their own study. Thus, we can't really take their word for it when they haven't done the work themselves. It's like someone criticizing you for doing work when they've never even tried. It's not really logical, and that's kind of a hypocritical stance. My second point is that nothing is perfect. Nothing is perfect. I don't think we can really take any study and say that it is completely flawless. That's not just man. Man makes mistakes, certain things happen, but we have to take the evidence for what it is, as we've seen no counter evidence from the negative team. My third response is that within the evidence, it specifically said people are not as sensitive as Ensign would seem. It's not as sensitive as he evaluated. Now, this is number one, it's opinion. Sensitivity is an opinion. That's based off of psychology and different stuff. So the Center on Budget Policies and Priorities would submit that people aren't as sensitive to the estate tax, yet they still remain the fact that people are sensitive to it, just not in the severity. Now, the second thing is that when you look to the actual piece of evidence, stuff that they didn't read, it talks about how people actually should be concerned with changing their investment strategy, and it provides different options in order to avoid the estate tax. So what do we have here? We actually have a detailed strategy of how to avoid the estate tax. So this isn't exactly a credible evidence, and it's not an evidence in that. It's just kind of supporting the government's position that the estate tax is good. Moving down on to my fourth response, and that is of the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation. The Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation, two of the most reliable organizations in our country today, support the affirmative team's position. In fact, they go beyond that. They specifically support and cite the study done by Mr. Ensign from the American Family Farm Bureau. They specifically cite and advocate that specific study. All we've seen from the negative team is one different organization supporting the notion that there's some problems with this study. There's no really reason to prefer this. Moving on to their second argument, that of no logic. I have two responses. My first is that the estate tax causes liquidation. The estate tax causes liquidation. This goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning about how it actually hurts the poor more than it hurts the rich. Now, the rich generally, or what they inherit, is generally cash, liquid cash, stuff in bank accounts, actual cash, liquid money. But what the poor, middle and low income families actually receive in inheritance is majority property. Now, the estate tax includes several things. It doesn't just include cash. It includes all property, all stocks, all bonds, all payroll, the payroll of your company, and liquid cash assets. It's all encompassing. The government decides what value to value that at. Then they require you to pay yes beyond the exemption, whatever is beyond the exemption rate, which is very easily to reach right now. And in 2013, when it's lower, it just becomes that much easier. It requires you to pay taxes on that property. Now, this results in middle and low-income families having to liquidate off their assets, being basically forced to in order to pay the government off in liquid cash, something they don't readily have. Moving down, and then my second argument is that they didn't respond to the fact that the federal government spends 90% of the revenue it receives from the estate tax on getting people to comply with the estate tax. This also goes back to the fact that the economy wastes money in trying to avoid the estate tax. The estate tax is a completely flawed, inefficient policy. It doesn't get the job done, and it hardly brings any revenue in for the federal government. Without it, the economy would be boosted, the government wouldn't have to waste money, and all we see is the economy grow and government revenues thus grow in return. Let's go down to the next argument. They argue against under justification 2 that of business devastation. Now, the first argument is that of a term. I have 3 responses. My first is that their evidence was just talking about savings, and that with increased savings, you have fewer jobs. My first response is that our evidence was talking about savings and investment. So when we talk about both savings and investment, that's a balance, and thus we do create jobs, thus their evidence does not apply. My second response is that it wasn't specific to the estate tax. Their evidence was not specific to the estate tax. It just said, in general, when saving increases, no jobs are created because there's a lack of investment. But I think we've shown that with the estate tax, people would have the freedom to invest in their businesses without having to worry about their descendants, those that would inherit their property, having to pay the tax. Moving down to their second response, that of more taxes. They talked about the step up capital gains and that people don't have to pay the capital gains tax when they sell their property. The problem is that there's a difference. The estate tax requires individuals to sell off their assets. Again, the estate tax requires individuals to sell off their assets. That's their only option. When they owe large sums of money, generally in the amount of $1.2 million, that's the average for 2011, that an individual paid. $1.2 million in liquid cash, they have to sell off portions of their property in order to comply with this. The second thing is that capital gains is a choice, opposite to the estate tax. Capital gains is a choice. But with capital gains, you have the choice. You can weigh the disadvantages and advantages of selling off certain assets, certain property, and then you have to pay taxes. There isn't really an argument here, which brings me to my third point. That of, without the estate tax, there's no reason to have to step up capital gains provision. There's no reason to have it. Thus, without the estate tax, this argument is completely taken out because it's completely unnecessary. Moving down to their third response, that of government dissaving. Again, I have 3 responses. My first response is that this evidence was not specific to the estate tax. The evidence was not specific to the estate tax. Now, all of our evidence produced in the affirmative team's 1AC was specific to the federal estate tax. However, the negative team got up here and just produced some general arguments about dissaving and how when we lose revenue, the deficit increases, and this is bad for the economy because such and such. However, this wasn't a direct response to the estate tax. With removal of the estate tax, the government increases revenue. My second response is that it's not necessary. Not necessary. It's not necessary because the government would increase revenue. Thus, there would be no dissaving, no deficit increase, etc. My third response is that 90% is spent on compliance costs for the federal government. The IRS currently spends 90% of what the estate tax brings in revenue. They turn around and spend it trying to get people to comply with this. I've already stated this. Moving down to there again, when they talked about the 1.5 million jobs, and I said this is false evidence. I have 2 responses. My first is that this is power tag. The evidence did not say the study was completely false. It said there were a few flaws. Of course there's going to be a few flaws. I've already addressed this. And then finally, the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation agree with us, and they agree with our study that we presented. For these reasons, I would urge you to reject the estate tax. Thank you.
Starting off with the importance of the affirmative team, you said that we agreed that you increase investment?
Well, within your last speech, you said that investment is hindered. That's what I said you agreed with. Under your evidence, it specifically said, yes, investment is hindered, but the severity of the problem is contested. That's what you said in your last speech.
I see, interesting, thank you. Now, under the argument of the false evidence, you had several responses to this. Yes. First was that it's from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities.
Yes.
How is that bad that it's from this particular source? Did you give evidence why this source is not credible?
Basically, under my point was, why should we value the opinion of one organization over another? Why should one organization's opinion be valued?
Is Stephen an organization, or is he one person?
He's within an organization. He's a member of an organization.
I see, and it would be the family business.
The American Family Farm Businesses Bureau. Yes.
That one, thank you. Okay. Moving on to the second argument, talking about just thinking about this logically. You talked about liquidation, that poor people are going to have more burden.
Yeah,
how would you define poor?
Well, I was specifically more talking about the middle and low income families. And
So you would say $5 million is low income?
Well, no, I'm talking about, and I specifically talk about
this.
if you want to talk about income, I would consider middle and low income families those making less than, say, $250,000.
Okay, do people with $250,000 have to pay savings?
Yes, they do. People that make that sort of income, yes. And I talked about the property. We have specific examples of farms, how people inherit
So you're
farms.
saying the average middle-income American leaves behind a property value inheritance of over $1 million?
I would say not over $1 million. Yes, definitely.
Interesting, thank you.
And that's what I was saying. Yes.
Sure. Okay. Moving on to the argument under the second justification, I said that you only have to pay what's above the limit. This was never contested, so it's agreed to be affirmative, and that's how the tax works, right?
That is true. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. And now, talking about how few businesses pay the tax, that was also not contested. So you do agree that there aren't a lot of businesses that pay this, correct?
Well, if you want to compare them to the total amount of businesses in the United States, of course not. Not every business owner dies in the same year.
Right, of course.
That's just not going to happen. I mean, that's what nuked by China or Russia or something.
Moving on to the savings and investment argument, I talked about how an increase in saving but a decrease in investment will actually decrease jobs.
Yes.
And you argue that the evidence that's saving and investment?
I said that